It was a dark, starless night when Joachim was taken to his grave. The torrential rain fell incessantly, as if the very sky were lamenting Joachim's tragic fate. Every drop that hit the ground seemed to echo the despair he felt, his screams muffled by the damp, heavy earth that covered him more and more. The men, dressed in black, dug hurriedly, anxious to complete the macabre act before anyone could see them. Joachim, eyes wide with terror, struggled against the bonds that held him, his body trembling with fear and cold. The sound of the dirt falling on the wooden coffin sounded like drums of a funeral march, each shovelful bringing him closer to his terrible fate. Inside the coffin, the darkness was total. The air was stale, hard to breathe. Joachim felt the crushing weight of the earth on him, pressing against his chest, making it increasingly difficult to breathe. His screams, initially strong, became weak moans as he desperately fought to free himself. His nails tore at the wood, leaving marks that testified to his frantic struggle for life. But despite all his efforts, his strength began to abandon him. Each heartbeat sounded like a drum echoing in the wooden chamber, marking the inexorable passage of time. His thoughts became a chaotic mix of fear and anger, his mind clamoring for one last chance at revenge against those who condemned him to this cruel fate. As the last shovelful of earth fell, sealing his grave, Joachim felt a strange calm come over him. It was as if a part of him refused to accept death, a fire of rage and determination burning inside him. And so, as his consciousness faded, something deep and sinister began to awaken. Inside the coffin, the darkness was total and oppressive. The air was heavy, stale, making each breath a desperate struggle. Joachim, his body trapped and his spirit gripped by terror, could feel each frantic beat of his heart echoing against the wooden walls around him. He was cornered, trapped in a nightmare where hope dissipated like the air he was desperately trying to breathe. His fingernails, already raw, clawed at the wood in frantic movements, creating a sinister sound that seemed to echo in the void. The force of his blows diminished as time passed, each movement becoming weaker, more desperate. Tears streamed down his face, mingling with the sweat and dirt seeping through the small cracks in the coffin. Above ground, the storm raged on relentlessly, the thunder roaring like a hungry beast. The earth, saturated by the rain, weighed even more on the coffin, pressing against it like a shroud of inevitable death. Joachim, in the midst of his agony, felt the increasing pressure, as if the entire world were conspiring to crush him. But while his body succumbed to weakness, his mind refused to give up. Thoughts of revenge seethed in his consciousness, fueled by the hatred and injustice of his situation. Every memory of betrayal, every face of his tormentors, ignited his will to survive, to fight until his last breath. And then, at the height of his despair, something inexplicable began to happen. Joachim felt a strange calm come over him, a sense that, despite his body being on the verge of failure, his essence, his will, would not be contained by a mere coffin. A cold and sinister sensation began to spread through his body, foretelling an even darker fate for those who had betrayed him. As the last spark of life began to extinguish in his body, something deep and malevolent awakened within him. Joachim's spirit, laden with pain and rage, would not rest while his death remained unjustified. And so, as his body surrendered to the embrace of death, his spirit began to break free, preparing to emerge from the dark depths of the cemetery with a single purpose: revenge. At that exact moment when life slipped away from his body, an icy chill took over the cemetery. The moon, previously hidden by heavy clouds, peeked through a gap, casting a pale, spectral light over the ancient tombstones. It was then that the impossible happened. Joachim's spirit, laden with pain and anger, emerged from the ground. The air around Joachim's grave turned frigid, and an oppressive silence fell over the cemetery. His presence was palpable, a vengeful specter trapped between this world and the next. He floated among the graves, his hollow gaze reflecting deep fury and an insatiable desire for justice. His ethereal essence flickered like a beacon of terror, illuminating the shadows and causing the crows to caw restlessly. Joachim felt every detail of the living world with supernatural intensity. The night breeze, the smell of wet earth, everything was more vivid, more real. He knew exactly who his tormentors were, and one by one, they would pay for what they had done. The first of them was already in his sights, each step bringing Joachim closer to his nearest traitor. The spirit advanced, passing through physical barriers as if they were mere illusions. The old trees in the cemetery bowed as he passed, as if recognizing the presence of something beyond the ordinary. His fury was a fire that could not be extinguished, burning with an intensity that transcended death. And so, as the night deepened, Joachim's spirit roamed the cemetery, determined to exact his revenge. The one who had condemned him to a horrible death would not be safe. Each step of the spirit was a harbinger of the terror to come, a dark omen that justice would be served even from beyond the grave. The first to feel the cold touch of Joachim's vengeful spirit was his closest betrayer, Carlos. It was a moonless night, darkness dominating the small town as Carlos hurried along the deserted road. The cold wind whistled through the trees, making the shadows dance in an unsettling manner. Carlos, his heart racing, couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Then came the whisper, faint and distant at first, but soon it became an unmistakable call. "Why did you bury me alive?" Carlos stopped abruptly, his blood freezing in his veins. He looked around but saw no one. His body trembled, not just from the cold, but from the fear beginning to overtake his mind. He tried to quicken his pace, but every sound around him seemed amplified, every shadow more threatening. Suddenly, a chilling breeze passed over him, and Carlos felt a shiver run down his spine. It was as if invisible hands were touching him, bringing to the surface the horrible memory of what he had done. Before he could react, Joachim's ethereal figure appeared before him, floating silently, his empty eyes fixed on Carlos. Joachim's face, marked by pain and anger, seemed to glow with a supernatural light. Carlos tried to scream, but no sound came out of his mouth. His legs, once agile, now felt like lead. He turned and ran, each step a Herculean effort. But no matter how hard he tried to escape, Joachim's presence was always behind him, a vengeful shadow that wouldn't leave him in peace. Carlos could hear the constant whisper, closer and closer, more insistent. "You cannot escape what you did." At every corner, every dark alley Carlos turned, Joachim was there, floating like an unrelenting specter. Fear dominated his senses, his steps growing heavier and more uncoordinated. The irony of his situation was clear. He who had condemned Joachim to a slow, agonizing death now lived tormented by the same spirit he had tried to bury. And so, as Carlos ran desperately through the sleeping town, Joachim's spirit continued his pursuit, a harbinger of the terror that was to come for all those involved. As Carlos tried in vain to escape, Joachim's presence became more intense, more oppressive. Fear dominated his senses, his steps grew heavier, and every shadow seemed to whisper his name. Joachim was always there, an ethereal figure hovering silently, feeding on Carlos's dread. The following days were a constant torment. Carlos could barely sleep, haunted by nightmares in which Joachim pursued him relentlessly. In every corner, in every reflection, he saw Joachim's hollow eyes, filled with supernatural fury. The chase was relentless, a shadow that never left him in peace. Night after night, Carlos heard the sinister whispers, growing louder and clearer. "Why did you bury me alive?" His health deteriorated rapidly, guilt and terror corroding his sanity. He isolated himself, avoiding contact with everyone, but nothing seemed to keep Joaquim's presence at bay. Then, on a particularly cold and dark night, Carlos made a desperate decision. He returned to the cemetery, the very scene of his heinous crime. With trembling hands, he began to dig frantically, as if he could unearth his own demons. The earth was cold and damp, resisting every shovel he threw aside. But Carlos was determined, driven by an insane desire for redemption. Finally, when sweat and tears mingled on his pale face, he reached the coffin. He opened the lid with a desperate cry, hoping to find the peace he so craved. But instead, he was met with chilling emptiness and oppressive silence. Nothing remained but the echo of his own madness. At that moment, the truth struck him like lightning. Joaquim's revenge was not just a quest for justice, but an eternal condemnation. Carlos realized that peace would never be attained, that he was doomed to be forever haunted by the vengeful spirit he himself had created. And so, in the heart of the cemetery, surrounded by darkness and deadly silence, Carlos finally succumbed to the terror. His body collapsed beside the open coffin, his eyes wide, reflecting the pale light of the moon. The last thing he saw was Joaquim's spectral figure hovering above him, a sinister smile on his lips. The revenge was complete.